Question is that the report be considered and noted. The Honourable Member for Nelson, I think, this time.
Thank you, Mr President. I rise to make a contribution in response to this motion, and I thank the Honourable Member for Hobart for bringing it. We were just here discussing the independent review report, of course, in recent sitting week, and now we have the government's response, and I agree largely with your sentiments in relation to that. So I'll make some comments, I think, that are probably aligned to the ones you've already made and won't go into quite as much detail. Mr President, people watching here tonight could be forgiven for thinking this chamber is stuck on some form of perverse repeat loop. It was only last Tuesday we called for a comprehensive response from the government for the fourth independent review report of the Climate Change State Action Act 2008. Barely a week later we're here again, and because sadly we must be here again. The government's response to this critical independent review report, a response which was finally released on August 12th, a day after our debate in this place, following also I think prompting from the other place, cannot be allowed to be the last word on this matter, which is so crucial and paramount to the security of Tasmania and our community, not just now, but also, of course, into the future. Tasmanians could also be forgiven for wondering whether and when their government is ever going to take seriously the immediate threat the climate crisis poses to our state, our island, our way of life. Because, Mr President, this flimsy 12-page document that constitutes, apparently, a so-called government response does not indicate a responsible government grappling with a public policy crisis of the magnitude that this is, patently. As I considered the government's response document, Mr President, I recalled a statement made some time ago by representatives of Climate Tasmania, and I quote from that: "If Tasmania is to be a climate leader, then it needs leadership from its government." Well, Mr President, if this response is anything to go by, we will be experiencing that desperate leadership void for sure. Mr President, the mover of this motion has spoken at some length and detailed a good analysis, I think, of the government's response and its shortcomings. It doesn't actually take very long to do that, sadly. I'm not going to repeat everything, but I'm going to say I endorse the analysis provided already, and I do wish to present a brief summary of some key takeaways that I took away when I was reading this long-awaited response. My first relatively unfiltered thought was along the lines of, what in Lutruwita's good name am I reading here, Mr President? How is this serious? And where is the rest of it, Mr President? Where is the rest of it? That first sentence of the government response document states, the government is, and I quote, committed to practical balanced climate action. Well, putting aside the common sense or otherwise of attempting a balanced response to a clearly imbalanced crisis, that assertion by the government is then promptly contradicted entirely by its response to the careful, considered, very practical 7 recommendations presented by the independent review. Page 41 of the independent review report states very clearly, and I quote, "Together, the recommendations provide a roadmap to evolve the Act in a pragmatic way, focusing on deliverability, value, and moving from planning to action." And further, Mr President, I quote, "Collectively, these recommendations position Tasmania to move from planning to delivery, focusing resources on accountability for outcomes rather than processes." Mr President, surely there's not too much light between the definitions of practical and pragmatic, I would have thought. Yes, as the cop-out support in principle, response from the government to the 5 critical recommendations regarding reforming the Act clearly indicates, the problem is the expectation of meaningful action. We expect meaningful action, Mr President. Silly, silly us. Once again, we see the habitual pattern of this government hibernating back into its comfort zone and resorting to self-congratulatory spin to bat away independent, evidence-based roadmaps for real action. This pattern must be challenged every single time it crops up, Mr President, and depressingly, it crops up again and again and again. But we cannot afford to keep ignoring the evidence, the science, the independent advice of experts who are trying to help, Mr President. I could go on regarding that disturbing pattern, but I'm going to move on instead. Additional to the government's lazy reliance on procedural changes rather than action and outcomes, as emphasised by the independent review report, is its shameless reiteration on Tasmania's apparent reduction of carbon emissions, while carefully not acknowledging the crucial warnings that our net zero status is under threat due to the failure to focus on delivering broad-based decarbonisation across all Tasmanian sectors. Members would have received a media statement this afternoon from Climate Tasmania, I imagine. I think it probably came through to all of us. That statement makes this extremely important point, and I quote from the media statement from Climate Tasmania. The group has called for Parliament as a whole to force the government to accept that our emissions from petrol, diesel, gas, etc. are not being reduced, and to act decisively to pass dramatically stronger laws which make it clear that it takes the threat from climate change seriously. I think that sums up what should have been at the forefront of the government's response to the independent review report, Mr President, as an acknowledgement that we must act on broad-based decarbonisation of all sectors rather than a blinkered reliance upon carbon sequestration from land use in isolation, plus immediate legislative reform to strengthen our Climate Act, both of which sound like practical and balanced actions to me, but neither of which we are getting from this government. Mr President, I agree with Climate Tasmania in this regard, and further, I also agree that clearly we cannot rely on the government alone to heed the advice of independent experts in a manner which reflects the urgency of the climate challenge which confronts us as a community. It's going to take a concerted effort by this Parliament and the broader Tasmanian community to shake the government from its complacency and lethargy. It's worth noting the government's response does not provide any good reason for its lethargic in-principle support to the independent review recommendations, which in some quarters are considered rather conservative and minimalist in themselves, Mr President. The government just doesn't seem to want to. It just doesn't seem to get it, Mr President. Without comprehensive, ambitious and focused climate action, the brutal fact is Tasmanians will pay the price, economically, environmentally and socially. Yet somehow, the government, as indicated by its minimalist and unsatisfactory response to this 2-year independent review, just refuses to get it. Mr President, before I wind up, I want to use this opportunity to draw attention to the photograph illustrating the front of the government's response to the 2024-25 Independent Review Report document. Mr President, I hope members may have the copy of the document in front of them. It's a beautiful photograph on the cover. It's one which depicts a narrow band of rugged Tasmanian coastline. The momentum of that wild ocean can be felt through the page. I almost expect to hear the crash of the waves rolling in to break on those rocks. It's a masterful photograph, and it's the work of Chris Creer, to whom I wish to take this opportunity to pay tribute.
The late. Wonderful.
Chris was a lovely, genuine, compassionate man who, while immersing himself in his environmental and social justice pursuits, gave just as much back to the Tasmanian community. I had the privilege of getting to know Chris when he was working with Reconciliation Tasmania on the Yes campaign for the Voice referendum of 2023. It was a deep and shocking loss when he was taken from us too soon in 2024. However, Reconciliation Tasmania established the Chris Creer Reconciliation Scholarship, which is available to a Tasmanian Aboriginal student commencing a bachelor degree for the first time in any discipline at the University of Tasmania. A wonderful legacy to honour Chris, the dedicated social justice advocate, journalist and photographer. It's bittersweet to see Chris's beautiful work on this document. It would be all any government of the day could hope for, to leave an equivalent legacy of courage, determination and beauty that speaks to and inspires Tasmanians now and in the future, just as Chris achieved with one evocative photograph which preserved something so unique, so special and so Tasmanian as this wild coastline. Mr President, to return to the government response of the 2024-25 independent review of the Climate Change State Action Act 2008, I consider that response to be disappointing, inadequate and irresponsible in the extreme. And I could say a lot of other words, Mr President, that would be much stronger in tone but also far, far less parliamentary. But despite the fact the government's response is head-in-hand inducing, we cannot afford to throw our hands up in the air and give up. All members in this place and the other have a responsibility to keep reiterating to the government whenever necessary, stop, do not pass go, do not stop, do not keep your complacency at this level, try again. This lacklustre, ridiculously complacent, self-congratulatory government response could not be further from what is required. It's not good enough, Mr President. In fact, it's quite shameful. This government needs to get out of the parallel universe in which it appears to have conveniently ensconced itself, face up to the climate change reality, which presents such serious challenges, along with some opportunities for Tasmania and Tasmanians, and get stuck into the task at hand, not just the rhetoric. To close, I return to that earlier Climate Tasmania quotation I cited. However, I think it requires amending. I think it should be, if Tasmania is to be a climate leader, then it needs leadership from its government and it requires continual vigilance from its parliament and pressure from the Tasmanian community. Because, Mr President, no matter how repetitive it may seem, I will continue to take every opportunity, as I know many others in this place will, to remain vigilant on behalf of my electorate and the Tasmanian community more broadly, and demand this government takes all necessary evidence-based action to address the impact of the climate crisis. As per the motion before us, I do note the government's response to the report of the independent review of the Climate Change State Action Act 2008, and I do so, Mr President, with an incredibly deep sense of disappointment and grave concern. And on that, noting the time, Mr President, before I complete my contribution, I might move that the debate stand adjourned for the purposes of a dinner break.
Question is that the debate stand adjourned. Those of that opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The debate stands adjourned. Honourable Member for Nelson.
Thank you, Mr President. I believe I had concluded my remarks, noting the government's disappointing and irresponsible response to the independent review of the Climate Change Act report, and I'll conclude at that. Thank you.